Night, in its quietest form, settled over the world like a long exhale. Stars shimmered above the horizon, faint and distant, as if they too were growing tired. The earth breathed slowly, its rhythms softened by the weight of countless lives drifting beneath the dark sky. In this calm expanse, the narrator, the silent witness who has watched every age unfold, saw the familiar signs of a world entering its final phase of forgetting. No thunder announced it, no divine proclamation, no celestial chariot streaking across the heavens. The end of Kali Yuga did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like fatigue, like a candle burning low, like the last leaf letting go of an old tree. The narrator watched gently, speaking as softly as drifting clouds. It is not destruction that ends an age. It is exhaustion. And truly, the world was exhausted. People everywhere were carrying burdens too heavy for their hearts. Burdens of anger, fear, loneliness, restlessness, and the quiet ache of forgetting something sacred. The narrator could feel it all. The way minds raced, even in sleep. The way breaths grew shallow. The way hearts searched for meaning beneath noise. Kali Yuga was an age of forgetting, where the inner light became a small ember buried beneath layers of dust. Yet even as it dimmed, it never vanished. The narrator saw those tiny embers glowing inside every soul, fragile but alive. The signs were gentle at first. Rivers flowed a little more slowly, as if the weight of unspoken prayers made their waters heavy. Winds grew tired of carrying human noise, and sometimes fell still for days, curling into the corners of deserted valleys. Forests whispered less often, and when they did, their voices were hoarse from centuries of unheard warnings. Even time itself seemed to sway. Days felt shorter, though they held the same number of hours. Years passed quickly while moments of peace grew rare. People often said, "Time is running," but time wasn't running. It was unraveling, thread by thread, like an old cloth losing its weave. The narrator drifted through cities where lights never dimmed, where people chased shadows shaped like success, comfort, approval, or escape. The soft glow of dawn was missed by many. Moonlight was rarely seen except through windows that reflected more screens than stars. Yet in the stillness of night, when the mind quieted and the world paused its endless hum, the narrator could still sense the ancient rhythm beating beneath everything. The rhythm of Dharma, wounded but alive. The voice of the narrator flowed like warm water. Even in the darkest age, light remembers its home. And so began the quiet approach of the end, not as fear, not as chaos, but as a gentle remembering. Somewhere deep in the Himalayas, snow began to melt weeks earlier than it should, not from heat, but from warmth, a warmth rising from the earth itself, soft as devotion waking from a long dream. Somewhere in the southern seas, waves took on a strange calm, as though listening for footsteps of someone returning. Somewhere in a forgotten forest, a deer paused mid-step, ears lifted, sensing an ancient presence passing by. The narrator saw all of it with tranquil clarity and knew. The world was preparing, silently, for the end of an age. But endings, in the language of the cosmos, are not finalities. They are exhalations, the breath that follows too much holding. The truth of Kali Yuga's end was not terrifying. It was gentle, soft, inevitable. It sounded more like prayer than thunder, more like sleep than storm. For as the age grew heavy, humanity, collectively, unknowingly, began to whisper questions that had not been whispered in centuries. Why am I here? What am I becoming? What have we forgotten? Where is the peace we once knew? The narrator felt the vibrations of these questions rise like incense from millions of minds. And where questions rise, answers begin to awaken. On a night lit by a thin crescent moon, the first true sign appeared. It was not in the sky. It was not in the mountains. It was not in any palace or kingdom. It was in the heart of a child. She sat alone by a window, the world dark outside, her lamp flickering. She folded her hands, not because she was taught to pray, but because something within her moved on its own. Her breath softened, her eyes closed, and from her chest rose a small, steady glow, an ancient memory of light. The narrator watched this with profound stillness. For a single awakened heart can shift the breath of an entire age. And in that child's gentle breath, the world felt, for the first time in centuries, a tremor of hope. The end of Kali Yuga had begun, not through destruction, but through awakening. A soft, slow, quiet awakening. Not loud enough for kings to notice. Not bright enough for scholars to debate. Not grand enough for temples to declare. But deep enough to stir the sleeping truth of an age. The narrator whispered, "When one heart remembers, the world begins to remember." And so, beneath the calm night sky, the first ripple of change spread outward like a yawn from an ancient, drowsy universe ready to rise again. The night deepened, settling over the world like a blanket stitched with memories. The stars above flickered gently, as if whispering their own quiet stories to those who could still listen. The narrator drifted through this silence, observing the tender shift that had begun, a change so subtle that even the wind held its breath to feel it. The child who had awakened a faint glow within her heart fell asleep beside the window, her palms still lightly touching. The radiance within her faded from sight, but it did not disappear. It pulsed softly, syncing with the gentle rhythm of dreams. And in the invisible realms, something vast stirred, something ancient, something patient, something waiting through lifetimes for this very moment. For ages, the world had grown increasingly restless. People hurried through their lives with minds full and hearts empty, forgetting that peace once lived naturally in the spaces between thoughts. But now, on this quiet night, a single heart had opened, and the universe responded like a sleeping musician who recognized the first note of a forgotten song. This was the first echo, and the narrator, witness to all ages, knew what would follow. As the child slept, the world shifted in small, almost imperceptible ways. A monk meditating in a distant monastery suddenly felt a warmth at the center of his spine. He didn't know why, but his next breath settled deeper than any breath he had taken in years. A farmer in a quiet village awoke from a dream of golden light, unsure if it was a memory or a blessing. When he stepped outside, the morning air felt unusually still, as if the dawn itself was pausing to listen. A traveler crossing the desert saw the horizon shimmer in a way that felt less like heat and more like hope. These were small things, the kind of signs the world usually overlooks, but in the language of ages, they were profound. The narrator felt them ripple through creation like soft waves, each one building upon the last. "This is how ages turn," the narrator murmured gently, "not by force, but by remembrance." The sun rose with unusual softness that morning. The light did not pierce, it caressed. It spread across rooftops, forests, seas, and mountains with the patience of something that knew its time had come. It touched temples and cities alike, making no distinction between holy and ordinary, because in the eyes of the divine, everything carries holiness. Somewhere in the bustling heart of a city, a young man paused on his way to work. He felt a sudden pressure in the center of his chest, not painful, but present, like a knock on a long-closed door. He placed his hand over his heart and stood still while crowds flowed around him. For the first time in years, he inhaled without rushing. He exhaled without worry. He didn't know it, but he too had felt the echo. Kali Yuga was ending not by disaster, but by hearts slowing down enough to feel again. Throughout the day, subtle changes continued. Birds sang with a little more clarity. Leaves rustled with a little more intention. The earth vibrated faintly, as though preparing for a long-awaited exhale. And the narrator saw something else, something deeper. For the first time in centuries, the world was beginning to listen. A listening world is a healing world. A listening world is a world nearing its turning point. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a gentle silence spread across the land. Streets grew quieter. Conversations softened. Even the waves along the shores retreated with a quieter rhythm. In that collective hush, the narrator drifted through the spaces between thoughts, observing the blossoming stillness. Somewhere in the mountains, a sage who had meditated for decades suddenly opened his eyes, not because his meditation was broken, but because he sensed a shift, a change in the very breath of the universe. He whispered into the gathering dusk. A cycle approaches its close. His words were not prophecy. They were recognition. Every age, no matter how dark, ends with a moment of gentle honesty, when the world looks inward and sees itself clearly. Kali Yuga was beginning to do just that. The narrator floated over cities and villages, noticing how people were unknowingly carrying this new softness within them. Not enough to change their lives yet, not enough to calm their chaos, but enough to make them pause, even for a heartbeat. And one heartbeat, if shared by millions, can become the pulse of an age. As night returned, the narrator felt the world settle into its own breath. The stars seemed brighter, not because they had changed, but because the eyes that saw them had grown a little quieter inside. On a hill outside a quiet village, an old woman lit a small lamp at her doorstep. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she had not spoken in years. Not because she doubted it, but because life had become too loud, too fast, too demanding. Tonight, she remembered it effortlessly. Her flame flickered. A breeze touched her cheek. The narrator smiled. This is how Kali Yuga softens, the narrator said, not through destruction, but through gentle awakening. The end of the age was not arriving like a warrior. It was arriving like the first sigh after a long cry, like the return of a forgotten melody, like a seed cracking open beneath the soil. Quiet, subtle, certain. The narrator drifted upward, rising above the clouds, observing the world from a vantage untouched by time. And from there, the truth became even clearer. The world was preparing for a visitor, a presence foretold, forgotten, and awaited. Not in fear, but in longing. The end of Kali Yuga would not be chaos. It would be awakening. The narrator whispered into the sleeping world below. Rest now. A new dawn waits in the unseen. And deep within the fabric of time, something stirred in response. Ancient, gentle, destined. The night that followed stretched, long and velvety, a soft blanket drawn across a restless world. Yet beneath that calm darkness, something ancient was beginning to breathe again. The narrator, who had watched countless ages rise and fall, drifted gently above the landscape and felt the trembling of subtle change running beneath the soil of existence. For ages, humanity had lived in noise. Noise of thought, noise of desire, noise of fear, a constant hum that had drowned the inner voice of truth. But now, pockets of silence began to appear like tiny islands in a churning sea. In one village, a potter sat by his wheel, shaping clay with practiced motions. He had always worked mechanically, thoughts racing ahead to markets, debts, and unfinished tasks. But this evening, as his fingers moved over the wet clay, he felt a stillness settle around him. His hands slowed. His breath deepened. For a moment, he was simply there, shaping, breathing, being. No past, no future, just presence. He did not realize it, but the clay remembered ancient lessons his ancestors once knew. That creation is prayer without words. The narrator drifted near him, watching the man's quiet transformation. It wasn't enlightenment. It wasn't realization. It was just softness. And in the closing age of Kali Yuga, softness was a great awakening. Far across the world, in a mountain fortress, a king stood alone on his balcony. The stars shimmered in the cold sky above him, and for the first time in years, he allowed his mind to pause. Not to scheme, not to command, not to fear. Just pause. He looked at the night and wondered, with a gentle ache, when did the world begin moving faster than I could breathe? The narrator watched him with compassion, for rulers too are children of time, often burdened by crowns heavier than destiny itself. On this night, the king felt a tenderness he had forgotten, the desire to live simply, quietly, without endless ambition. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. That single breath sent another ripple across the fabric of the age. Kali Yuga was loosening its grip. In another place, a city crowded with lights and hurried feet, an elderly man sat alone on a rooftop. He gazed out at the sprawling chaos below and hummed a tune from his childhood. It was a lullaby his mother had once sung, a melody almost forgotten. As the tune left his lips, the memory returned. Warm hands, soft humming, a night without fear. Tears gathered in his eyes, not from sorrow, but from the beauty of remembering something untouched by the world's hardness. Below him, the city still buzzed with restlessness, but for him, the world grew quiet. The narrator listened to his song. Memories like that are lanterns, glowing even when the age grows dim. And far away, a lone ascetic seated under a banyan tree felt the breeze shift. His eyes opened slowly. He sensed an unseen presence, not divine, not mortal, but the natural movement of time itself curling toward transformation. He whispered, "It begins." But change, the narrator knew, did not begin in the grand or the dramatic. It began in the fragile spaces of everyday life, in a breath, a pause, a memory, a moment of unplanned stillness. Even nature felt the shift. Trees that had stood silently for centuries released a softer perfume that night. The rivers ran clearer. The moon shone with unusual steadiness, as though anchoring itself for what was to come. Dogs barked less. Birds settled sooner. The ocean tides seemed to sigh like a tired soul relieved of a burden. The narrator moved through these scenes with profound gentleness, like a traveler not wanting to disturb the sleeping world. Time itself felt delicate, as though one harsh note could break its balance. But there was no harshness, only quiet, the quiet of something old coming to an end, the quiet of something ancient preparing to begin again. In a forgotten hermitage deep in the forest, an old scripture lay open on the floor. Its pages fluttered despite the absence of wind. A thin golden light traced the faded Sanskrit letters, illuminating a prophecy written long ago. When hearts remember silence, Kali Yuga shall loosen its shadow. The narrator read it, though the narrator did not need the reminder. Prophecy is not prediction. It is recognition of patterns older than time. And the pattern had begun. Across the world, more small awakenings continued. A young mother nursing her child felt her heart ache with an emotion too pure for words. She didn't know why, but she kissed the child's forehead with a tenderness that felt ancient, as though she were part of a lineage stretching back to the first cradle of humanity. A wandering musician paused mid-performance when his instrument suddenly resonated with deeper warmth. His fingers trembled, and for a moment he felt he wasn't playing the music was playing him. The melody that emerged was one he had never practiced, yet it sounded familiar, like a memory from another life. A merchant counting his coins late at night suddenly lost interest in the numbers. A strange peace settled into his bones. He closed the box, extinguished the lamp, and lay down to sleep without planning tomorrow. A child in another country woke from a dream filled with golden radiance. She did not understand the dream, but she felt safe, a feeling rare in her life. When she told her parents, they smiled gently, unaware that they too had dreamed of light. These were not miracles. They were reminders. The narrator drifted higher, gazing down at the wide expanse of the world. In the soft glow of the moon, the land looked peaceful, as though an invisible blanket of stillness had been draped across nations, forests, oceans, and deserts. And the narrator whispered, almost like a lullaby, "It is in softness that endings are born." Far away, in the celestial realm, ancient forces stirred. Devas paused in their eternal duties. Sages looked up from their meditations. The cosmos itself held a breath that had been waiting for millennia. The world was preparing, not for destruction, not for chaos, not for fire or flood, but for remembrance. The narrator could already sense the faintest outline of what would come, like seeing dawn's glowing hour before sunrise. But the world below was not yet ready to see it. For now, it needed only quiet, gentle shifts, small awakenings. The age was softening, and in that softness, a new story was preparing to be born. As midnight deepened into its stillest hour, the narrator drifted across a world wrapped in quiet. In this hour, even the shadows seemed gentler, soft-edged, and unhurried. A subtle calm pulsed beneath the darkness, like a heartbeat hidden in the earth itself. The narrator knew this was the hour when ages listen. For centuries, humanity had moved too fast to hear the whisper beneath existence. But tonight, something was different. It was as though the entire world, all lands, all people, all creatures, had taken a single, long breath together. In a remote valley, mist curled over fields where crops shimmered faintly in moonlight. A shepherd resting under a tree lifted his head as though someone had called his name gently. But no one had. It was only the presence of something old, something familiar, like a warm memory brushing his cheek. He closed his eyes, feeling peace for the first time in years. Far away, on the coastline where waves had always seemed restless, the sea grew unusually calm. Fishermen sleeping in their small huts felt the ocean shift even in their dreams. Instead of their usual uneasy tossing, they slept deeply, as though cradled by a mother's hands. The narrator touched the edge of the waves, sensing a profound change rising. Not in the water, but in the world's breath. The age exhales, the narrator whispered. And truly, the world seemed to let go of something heavy. In a crowded city, where neon lights usually drown the softness of night, a sudden power outage plunged entire neighborhoods into darkness. People stepped out onto balconies, confused at first but soon mesmerized. For the first time in years, they saw the night sky completely. Jewel-toned stars sprinkled across the velvet heavens, quiet and eternal. Children pointed upward in awe. Old men wept softly without knowing why. Women smiled, remembering nights from their childhood when the sky looked just like this. Darkness, which had always been feared, suddenly felt like blessing. The narrator floated above the rooftops, watching how silence, real, deep silence, formed a strange comfort around the people. Their hearts slowed, their breaths softened. For one night, the world remembered itself. Elsewhere in a small house, a scholar sat at his desk, poring over an ancient scripture he had read 1,000 times. But tonight, the words glowed faintly under his lantern. A Sanskrit verse he had always skimmed suddenly rose into clarity. When the shadows lengthen in their final stretch, the world will hear the sound beneath silence. He leaned back in his chair, stunned, not by the prophecy itself. He had memorized it, but by the feeling that the verse was no longer history. It was moment, now, present. His hands trembled, not in fear, but in recognition. The narrator sensed his awakening and whispered softly, "The scriptures remember you when you remember them." But the awakening was not confined to sages, kings, or scholars. It touched everyone. A young woman, anxious from the burdens of life, suddenly felt a wave of calm wash over her as she stared at the moon through her apartment window. Tears slid down her cheeks, but they were not sad tears. They were the tears of a heart finally allowed to rest. A teacher writing lesson plans paused as a breeze slipped in through the cracks of the wooden door. She breathed in deeply. Something about the air felt ancient, pure. She closed her eyes and let her mind become quiet. She didn't know why, but she felt held. An old man sitting beside a dying fire whispered his wife's name, long gone, and felt, for the first time in decades, as though she sat beside him again, her presence soft as moonlight. Even in the wild forests, animals moved more gently. Predators did not hunt that night. Prey did not flee. The forest seemed to sway in one united rhythm, as though remembering a forgotten harmony. This was not magic. This was not miracle. This was the world aligning breath by breath. As the narrator glided through the silent forest, through the calm sea, through the sleeping cities, a truth unveiled itself. Kali Yuga was ending not in fury, but in tranquility. The end did not roar. It whispered. It whispered in dreams. It whispered in sighs. It whispered in pauses. It whispered in hearts weary from centuries of noise. And somewhere, in a place beyond maps, beyond time, a divine presence stirred. A presence foretold in the oldest scriptures. A presence destined to rise when the world remembered stillness. The narrator did not yet speak the name. It was not time. The world was still preparing. But the narrator could feel the pull of destiny, gentle as gravity, yet vast as eternity. Something holy was approaching, slowly, patiently, like dawn inching over the mountains. Not yet seen, but undeniably felt. As the first soft lines of dawn appeared on the horizon, the narrator whispered, "Sleep now, world. The light you have forgotten is finding its way back." With that, the entire world seemed to sigh as morning arrived. It was the softest sunrise in centuries, so gentle it felt like a mother waking her child with a kiss. And in that soft light, the first chapter of the end of Kali Yuga closed. Not in darkness, but in peace. Dawn spread gently across the world, as if it had learned, at last, to walk softly. The light touched rooftops and riverbanks, temples and towers, forests and fields, revealing a world that looked much the same as the day before, yet felt, in some subtle way, different. The narrator hovered in the quiet air of early morning, watching as the age shifted from night to day, from sleeping to waking, from forgetting to the first delicate hints of remembering. On the surface, life continued as usual. Markets opened, bells rang, children ran with school books pressed against their chests. Carts rolled, wheels turned, people hurried, as they always had, carrying invisible burdens of worry, expectation, and desire. But beneath this familiar movement, something invisible had begun to change. Kali Yuga had always been an age of density, thoughts heavy, hearts crowded, time thick with noise. But now, the narrator sensed the first cracks in that density, as though a mighty wall of stone had begun, somewhere deep inside, to loosen grain by grain. These cracks did not appear in governments, nor on battlefields, nor at the centers of power. They appeared in ordinary moments, in ordinary hearts. In a small village, a man known for his quick temper stood in his doorway, watching his young son spill a basket of freshly picked vegetables. Normally, anger would have risen quickly, hot and sharp. But today, something gave way inside him before the anger could form. The man inhaled. He saw the fear in his child's eyes. And instead of shouting, he knelt down and began picking up vegetables in silence. The boy stared, stunned. The man's hands shook, not from restraint, but from the shock of realizing that he had chosen gentleness over habit. The narrator watched quietly. This was a crack in the age. In a crowded city bus, a woman sat pressed between strangers, the weight of years heavy on her shoulders. Her mind was swirling with worries, debts, deadlines, expectations she could never meet. Usually, she would sink deeper into that whirlpool of thought. But today, as she stared absently out the window, she noticed a small tree growing through a crack in the pavement. Thin, fragile, but unmistakably alive. For reasons she could not explain, tears filled her eyes. She saw herself in that tree, tired, unnoticed, yet still growing somehow. For just a moment, she stopped thinking about what she lacked and simply admired the courage of that little trunk pushing towards light. This too was a crack in the age. In a classroom, children recited lessons from memory, their voices rising and falling in practiced rhythm. At the back of the room, a quiet boy usually lost in his own world suddenly looked up as a beam of sunlight landed on his desk, illuminating a tiny dust mote spinning like a star in miniature. He stared at it, mesmerized. It was such a small thing, yet in that moment, it felt like the entire universe had shrunk to the size of that floating speck, turning slowly, patiently, for no other reason than to exist. His mind, which was often clouded with confusion and noise, became clear for a heartbeat. And in that clarity, he felt a strange, simple joy. Another crack. Kali Yuga did not shatter like glass. It softened like clay. The narrator, drifting between these tender moments, saw that the cracks were not signs of destruction, but signs of light finding its way in. In the old stories, people had often imagined the end of Kali Yuga as a great catastrophe. Fire, flood, collapsing stars, a furious avatar tearing apart the darkness. But the untold truth was far quieter. Ages end not by being broken from the outside, but by being surrendered from within. Somewhere in the world, a warrior laid down his weapon after years of battle, not because he had lost, but because he was tired of winning the wrong kind of victories. Sitting beneath a tree, he realized there was no enemy left outside him. The real conflict had always been inside. He closed his eyes and let the tree shade his face. At the same time, in a village temple, a priest performing rituals by habit felt his voice falter. For a single instant, he realized his lips moved, but his heart did not. The realization humbled him. The next mantra he spoke came not from memory, but from longing. These were not dramatic events that history would record. There would be no inscriptions on stone about them. But in the subtle language of time, they were tremors. And tremors precede great shifts. The narrator rose higher, into the thin blue air where mountains kissed the sky. The snow peaks listened too, ancient and patient. They had watched many ages pass, seen Dharma rise and fall, watched kings come and go like passing clouds. From this height, Kali Yuga looked like a heavy cloak on the world's shoulders, worn frayed too tight. And the cracks were like loose threads weakening that cloak, preparing it to finally slip off. Down below, in a hermitage, a young seeker read from a sacred text about the four yugas, Satya, Trita, Dvapara, Kali. As he traced the lines with his finger, he whispered, "People fear Kali Yuga's end, but should we not also welcome it?" For the first time, he did not read the words as myth, but as cycle, as breath. He closed the book and listened. There, beneath the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves, he heard something else, a silence that did not feel empty, but full. The narrator smiled, unseen. Another crack. These cracks were not breaking the world. They were opening it to stillness, opening it to truth, opening it to the possibility that something ancient and luminous was making its way back. The age was beginning to peel away, layer by layer, like old bark from a tree, revealing underneath not destruction, but renewal. The narrator whispered in a voice softer than wind. The end of Kali Yuga is not a fall into darkness. It is a fall out of illusion. And somewhere, quietly, the world agreed. Day followed day with quiet persistence. On the surface, life in Kali Yuga looked unchanged. Arguments still flared, greed still moved unseen, fear still whispered in the corners of human hearts. And yet beneath this familiar pattern, the cracks continued to widen, not violently, but gently, like ice melting around a buried spring. The narrator drifted through the fabric of the world, touching places where the unseen shift had begun to deepen. In a busy marketplace, a young boy watched his father argue over the price of grain. Voices rose, faces tensed, hands gestured sharply. Normally, the boy would have grown anxious or withdrawn, absorbing the harshness without understanding. But today, something in him felt tired of the noise. He looked away from the quarrel and noticed a stray dog sleeping peacefully in the shade of a cart, belly rising and falling, completely undisturbed by the chaos around it. The animal's calm seemed to spill into the boy's chest. For a brief moment, he saw how strange it was that the dog, with no money, no status, no plans, looked more at peace than the adults who ruled his life. A small thought sprouted in his mind. Maybe peace isn't something you earn. Maybe it's something you allow. The thought passed like a breeze, but the crack it left remained. In a city full of towers and traffic, a woman sat alone in her room, surrounded by things she had spent years acquiring. Shelves full of books, clothes, ornaments, glowing screens, decorations from distant lands. All the objects the age had told her would make her whole. Yet she felt hollow. The hollowness had always frightened her, and she would usually drown it in distractions. But tonight, she did something different. She did not turn on the TV. She did not reach for her phone. She did not call anyone. She simply lay down, placed a hand over her heart, and let the emptiness be. It hurt. It ached. It felt like standing in a cold, dark room with no door. But she stayed. And then, very slowly, the emptiness softened. It did not disappear. It did not suddenly fill with joy or answers. It simply stopped feeling like an enemy. The narrator watched, deeply moved. When a person stops running from their own emptiness, a crack opens, one that lets in light. In a village temple, a young priest stood before the deity, bells in hand. He had been trained to perform rituals with perfect precision, to recite mantras without flaw. His voice was clear, his gestures graceful, his posture impeccable. Yet in his heart, something had long been missing. On this day, as he raised the bell, he suddenly felt how mechanical his devotion had become. The realization struck him with a quiet sadness. His eyes filled with tears, and his voice trembled as he began the mantra. OM. This time, the sound did not come only from his throat. It came from his longing, from his ache to feel what the mantras meant, from his yearning to know the presence he had spent years chanting to. The bell in his hand rang with unusual richness, as if pleased to finally be included in a prayer that was real. The narrator felt the vibration spread through the temple walls, through the air, through the hearts of those standing nearby. A crack in habit had become an opening for sincerity. Elsewhere, high in a stone tower, a scholar pondered ancient timelines. He traced the cycles of yugas, calculating ages and epochs, cross-checking verses from scriptures. For years, he had focused solely on when Kali Yuga would end, on numbers, signs, astronomical alignments. But today, as he stared at the diagrams scattered across his desk, a new question entered his mind. Does it matter when, if I do not know how it ends? This question stayed with him like a lantern in the dark. He realized he had spent years trying to predict what he had not yet learned to feel. He closed his books, walked to the window, and watched people moving below, carrying their own questions, their own quiet burdens. He pressed his forehead to the glass and whispered, "If the end is near, may it not be terror, may it be tenderness." The narrator heard this wish and knew. More and more hearts were beginning to want a gentle ending, not an explosive one. And what the collective heart of the world wants with sincerity, the universe eventually listens to. In a hidden monastery, an old sage addressed his disciples. They were eager, restless, curious. They asked him about visions of Kalki, the final avatar, the blazing force said to arrive at the end of the age, riding forth to destroy darkness. Will the avatar come with a sword of light? They asked. With thunder? With fire in the sky? The sage smiled softly. The untold truth, he said, voice as calm as a still lake, is that the end of Kali Yuga is not only about what comes, but about what we become. They listened quietly. If the avatar is to be recognized, the sage continued, it will not be by the fear he creates, but by the love he awakens, in a world tired of its own noise. His words were like seeds tossed gently into fertile soil. Not all would sprout at once, but they had been planted. The narrator watched the disciples as they processed his teaching. Some still held on to fantasies of cosmic battle. Others carried home the softer truth, that the end of an age begins in the silence of the heart. That night, more dreams came. A soldier dreamed of laying down his armor and discovering he still existed without it. A mother dreamed of a light walking across the earth, touching sleeping children on their foreheads. A homeless man dreamed of sitting beside a figure whose face he could not see, yet whose presence made him feel utterly at home. None of them remembered the full dreams upon waking, but each of them woke with a feeling. I want to be kinder today. And this was not trivial. It was proof that the cracks were widening. Kali Yuga, the age of confusion, noise, and separation, had begun to gently unravel from inside the human heart. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough. Enough for the narrator, ageless witness, to see clearly what few could. The end of the age would not come to punish. It would come to relieve. Humanity was growing tired of its own shadow, and tiredness, when honest, becomes surrender. The narrator floated above a world quietly reaching that point, the point where trying ends and trusting begins. Evening drifted across the world like a warm sigh, carrying with it the scent of dust, earth, and memories. The sun lowered itself slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the delicate stillness that had begun to settle over the age. The narrator floated gently through the dimming sky, watching as the cracks in Kali Yuga's weight grew subtly, quietly, inevitably deeper. The night wind moved with unusual softness, brushing leaves without bending them, stirring lamps without extinguishing their flames. It was as though nature itself was learning restraint, mirroring the shift happening inside the human heart. In a quiet village at the foot of a mountain, an elderly grandmother sat outside her home, weaving a basket for the following day. She had made thousands of baskets in her lifetime, each with the same steady rhythm: over, under, tighten, over, under, tighten. Her hands moved without thinking, her thoughts drifting through the daily concerns of age. But tonight, her fingers slowed. The rhythm faltered. She paused, sensing something subtle, a feeling she remembered from childhood, yet could not name. It was the feeling of being watched over, of being held by something gentle and unseen. She looked up. The stars glowed with a softness she hadn't seen in decades. They twinkled like distant lamps in a divine home. She whispered aloud, "It has been so long since the sky felt kind." A simple sentence, a powerful crack, for the sky had never changed. Her heart had. Elsewhere, in a bustling city where life rarely paused, a middle-aged man left his office late, as he always did. His mind was full of deadlines, targets, expectations he had never chosen but had learned to carry. The weight of responsibility had shaped his back, curled his mind, and hardened his breath. But today, as he stepped out into the cool night, he noticed something unusual. Silence. Not complete silence. The city still hummed, but a gentle quiet beneath the noise. A stillness beneath the movement. It reached him. He looked up at the skyline, and for the first time in years, he didn't think of tomorrow. He simply stood, listening. The narrator hovered near him, unseen. In that moment, a small gap appeared in the man's mind, the kind of gap where light enters. That was a crack. Far away, in a temple town, a group of pilgrims walked barefoot on dusty roads, chanting softly. Their voices rose and fell like waves. Among them was a young girl, no older than 10, who had joined her parents on this journey without understanding its significance. But as they approached the ancient temple at dusk, she felt something stir inside her, a sensation like someone gently touching her spine with warm fingertips. She stopped walking. Her mother tugged her arm lightly. "Come, the temple is close." But the girl stayed still, eyes wide. She didn't see the temple. She saw light. It shimmered faintly on the horizon, not bright enough for her parents to notice, but unmistakable to her. It moved slowly, like a figure walking across the sky. The girl blinked, and the vision dissolved. Yet the warmth in her spine remained. The narrator watched with quiet wonder. Children often perceive cracks in the age long before adults do. Their hearts are closer to the source of truth. In a quiet forest, an ascetic sat in meditation beneath a tall peepal tree. He had spent decades searching for insight, battling inner storms, confronting shadows of ego and desire. His breaths were long, practiced, controlled. But tonight, something unexpected happened. His breath softened on its own. He inhaled without intention, exhaled without effort. He felt no need to hold, no need to guide, no need to push away. It was as if the universe itself was breathing through him. A single tear rolled down his cheek, not of sorrow, not of joy, but of recognition. He whispered, "The age softens not through men, but through grace." His voice dissolved into the forest. The narrator rested for a moment at the top of the tree, listening to the branches sway. The trees, too, felt the cracks widening, not as danger, but as relief. The forest had carried the noise of humanity for centuries. Now it sensed peace returning, drop by drop. In a distant land, across oceans and deserts, a scientist looked through a powerful telescope, expecting to observe a comet predicted to pass near Earth. But instead of the comet, he saw something else, a faint, shimmering distortion in the night sky. A ripple, not of dust, not of gases, something deeper. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, recalibrated the instrument. The ripple remained. It was as though space itself had quivered. He sat back in his chair, confused. A feeling settled into his chest, one he had not felt since childhood. Awe. He didn't know it, but he had observed something profound. A shift in the subtle fabric of the cosmos. A cosmic crack. The narrator drifted far above, observing the world as a whole. Continents sleeping, oceans breathing, mountains glowing faintly under the moonlight. Everywhere, cracks were forming. Some cracks were in human behavior, some in human thought, some in the unseen layers of nature, some in the very architecture of time. And all these cracks, fragile, gentle, unassuming, pointed toward a single truth. The age was tiring of its own heaviness. Kali Yuga, for all its noise, was built upon illusion. The illusion of separation, of ego, of endless craving, of forgetting. And as illusion weakens, reality begins to shine through. The narrator felt that shine. It was faint, it was distant, but it was growing stronger. A presence, not yet revealed, was beginning its slow journey toward the world. A presence foretold, a presence forgotten, a presence inevitable. Something holy was approaching, not with thunder, not with fire, not with wrath, but with light. The narrator whispered to the turning earth. The cracks are not the breaking of the world. They're the world learning how to breathe again. And slowly, silently, the world breathed. Night returned again, slow and shimmering, stretching across the earth like a silken veil. In the darkness, the cracks running through the age glowed faintly, not visible to human eyes, yet clear as constellations to the narrator, who drifted gently above the turning world. These cracks were not wounds. They were beginnings. The world was shedding an old skin quietly, patiently, without haste. High in the mountains, the wind moved through the valleys with a strange gentleness, brushing along the ridges as though reading ancient inscriptions carved into stone by time itself. The mountains had always been silent witnesses to the ages, Satya, Trita, Dvapara, Kali, and they too sensed the nearing shift. The narrator perched briefly on a snowy peak, feeling the tremor beneath the earth. It did not feel like danger. It felt like release. In the bustling plains below, where millions lived and dreamed, the cracks widened in ways no one could see, but many could feel. In a small home, a young mother sat beside her sleeping baby. The child stirred, opening tiny eyes that glimmered with a clarity older than his short life. He reached out, touching the air as though greeting someone unseen. For just a moment, the mother felt a warmth settle around them. Not from the room, not from the lamp, but from something deeper. She whispered, "An angel must have passed." The narrator smiled. Not an angel, a shift in the age's breath. In another part of the world, far from temples and pilgrimages, a group of teenagers sat under a bridge, sharing stories, escaping the hardness of life. One of them, usually loud and defiant, suddenly fell quiet. A strange feeling washed over him, a softness he didn't know how to explain. He watched the river flowing beneath the bridge, glittering under the moonlight. For the first time, he wondered what peace actually felt like. Not excitement, not numbness, not distraction. Peace. The thought alone opened a crack inside him. Small, fragile, but real. The narrator drifted near, letting the boy's sudden tenderness ripple outward. Even the river seemed to slow, reflecting a world that had started remembering stillness. Across the ocean, where storms usually gathered with force, the skies remained clear longer than usual. Fishermen resting on their boats felt the calm extend strangely, as though nature was pausing to listen to something approaching from afar. In ancient texts, sages had written of this phenomenon. When the end of the darkness nears, the winds will pause and wonder. Tonight, The winds did exactly that. The narrator moved through the quiet air, observing how even the elements had begun to notice the small ruptures in the age, how the rhythm of existence was shifting in preparation for something profound. Somewhere deep in a thick forest, a lion stood still, ears forward, sensing a distant vibration. Not prey, not threat, something different. Its muscles relaxed, its breath slowed. Predators do not calm easily. This was a crack in the primal fabric of the world. In a monastery perched on the edge of a cliff, monks concluded their evening chants. As the last note faded, the head monk remained seated for a moment longer. His usually steady heart began to flutter as though touched by an unseen breeze. A whisper rose inside him. Not long now. He opened his eyes and bowed his head. He did not know what was coming, but he knew who. The narrator, floating beyond the monastery walls, sensed the old monk's realization. The cracks in Kali Yuga were no longer subtle. They were beginning to hum gently, a soft, steady vibration rising from humanity's collective heart. It sounded like longing, like yearning for truth, like a world tired of illusions. In a remote village, a group of elders gathered around a fire, discussing the unusual calm that had settled over their land. Animals behaved strangely kind. Children were surprisingly thoughtful. Rain arrived gently instead of in harsh bursts. One elder, eyes clouded with age yet sharp with intuition, murmured, "The world feels as if it is preparing a place for someone." The fire crackled softly, as if in agreement. The narrator drifted past the flame, feeling the truth of the old man's words echo through the night. Yes, the world was preparing a place. In a lonely desert, under a sky full of ancient stars, a wanderer walked barefoot across cool sand. He carried no belongings, no home, no destination. Yet tonight, he felt guided, as though the desert itself encouraged his steps. He paused, looking up at the sky. The stars shimmered slowly, deliberately, forming a faint arc that resembled a celestial path. He felt a whisper in his mind. "Walk. The age waits." He did not understand, but he continued walking, tears forming without cause. That tear was a crack. Cracks continued appearing everywhere. In the sigh of a widow who finally forgave life for its losses. In the smile of a young man who offered his seat to a stranger without hesitation. In the moment a thief returned a wallet he had stolen, confused by the guilt that washed over him. In the old musician who suddenly found his broken instrument producing the purest note of his life. These are not miracles. They were soft ruptures in the age's spell. Each rupture allowed something divine to seep quietly into the world. And somewhere, beyond mortal sight, beyond celestial realms, a presence stirred more clearly. The narrator turned toward the distant horizon of time. A glow shimmered at its edge. Faint, small, gentle, but unmistakable, like the first star appearing before dawn, like a promise whispered ages ago. Like a footstep taken from beyond creation's threshold. Kalki, not yet revealed, not yet descended, was stirring. Not in wrath, not in fury, but in response to humanity's quiet longing. For ages, people had cried out in fear. Now they called out in humility. And the universe answers humility far faster than fear. The narrator whispered across the turning world. The cracks are becoming windows, and through them, light approaches. The world slept that night with a softness it had not felt in centuries. Something holy was on its way. The night before a new kind of dawn is often the most delicate. The world does not know what it is waiting for, only that it is waiting. The air feels fuller. The silence feels deeper. Even dreams seem closer to waking. The narrator floated softly above the earth, sensing that a turning point, long written in the quiet pages of time, was nearing its gentle edge. Kali Yuga's cracks had widened into quiet openings. Through them, light had begun to seep back into the human heart. Not a blinding light, not a harsh revelation, but a soft, remembering glow. In a valley covered in thick morning mist, a boy walked along a narrow path with a bundle of firewood on his back. He was used to this daily task. His thoughts usually wandered to small worries, chores to finish, tasks to complete, words that had hurt him. The veil between the world and the divine was thinning. Not everywhere, not in all hearts, but in enough. The presence that would one day be called Kalki was still beyond sight, still beyond form. But its intention had already entered the age, like the scent of rain before clouds gather, like the coolness that touches the air before dawn, like the way a room feels different an instant before someone you love walks in. The world could not yet see this, but it could feel it, and the narrator whispered gently, "The end of Kali Yuga is not the end of the world. It is the return of light to a world that had forgotten how bright it could be." Somewhere, a poet paused mid-sentence, sensing those words unspoken. Somewhere, a mother stroked her child's hair and hummed a melody she didn't realize carried the rhythm of that truth. Somewhere, a lonely man standing at the edge of a bridge stepped back instead of forward, feeling a presence that told him quietly, "Stay." The age was still dark in many ways, but darkness no longer owned the night. Something else was entering. Softly, slowly, lovingly. The light that returns had begun its descent. The world continued to move through its habits, waking, working, talking, sleeping, but beneath the familiar patterns, an unseen rhythm was changing. The weight of Kali Yuga still lingered, yet it no longer felt absolute. It was as though a soft hand had been placed upon the pulse of the age, steadying it, slowing it, soothing it. The narrator floated gently above the turning earth, watching as the presence of light, not yet embodied, yet undeniably approaching, began to touch lives in deeper, quieter ways. In a crowded city hospital, a nurse moved from room to room, carrying exhaustion like a cloak on her shoulders. Night after night, she had watched people cling to life, fear its loss, and fight against the inevitable. It had worn her down, chipping away at her spirit. On this night, she entered the room of an elderly man who had no visitors. He lay still, breath shallow, eyes half closed. She adjusted his blanket, checked his pulse, and turned to leave. But something stopped her. A warmth, subtle but unmistakable, brushed against her back, like gentle sunlight through a window. She turned and looked at the man again. He was gazing at her now, his eyes clear, soft, almost smiling. "You are tired," he whispered. She nodded before she could stop herself. A tear rose unexpectedly. He took a slow breath and said, "Thank you for staying in a world that finds it so easy to leave." His words entered her heart like a small, healing flame. Something inside her cracked, not with pain, but with release. For the first time, she felt seen, not as a function, not as a worker, but as a soul. The narrator observed this moment and felt the signature of the approaching light. Compassion had begun to mirror itself. In a quiet village school, a teacher paused during a lesson when she noticed one of her students staring out the window, lost in thought. In the past, she might have scolded him for not paying attention. Today, she did something different. She walked over and followed the direction of his gaze. Outside, a single tree stood against the blue sky, its branches swaying gently, leaves glimmering in the sun. The boy spoke softly, almost afraid of his own words. Sometimes it feels like the tree is listening. Instead of dismissing him, the teacher nodded. "Maybe it is," she replied. The class, sensing something unusual, fell quiet. The moment held a stillness that felt almost sacred. The narrator smiled. Kali Yuga had long been an age where people spoke without listening, to each other, to themselves, to the world. Now listening was returning. Far away, in a monastery carved into the side of a mountain, a young monk sweeping the stone floors paused when he heard distant thunder. Yet the sky above was clear. The thunder came again, not from the sky, but from within. He closed his eyes and focused on the sound. It wasn't loud, not frightening, just a steady, rhythmic beat, like a drum echoing through an infinite space. He had been taught of the Dharma drum, the cosmic sound that pulses when Dharma is about to be restored. He had always taken it as metaphor. Now he heard it. His hands trembled. The broom fell. He knelt on the floor without understanding why, tears wetting the stone beneath him. The narrator drifted just above the temple roof, feeling that same pulse, not as noise but as alignment. The light was drawing nearer. In the silence between worlds, that light moved closer to the edge of manifestation. It did not rush. It did not force. It flowed with the ease of a river returning to the sea. In the subtle realms, devas paused in their radiant beauties, sensing the approach. Some bowed. Some smiled. Some whispered mantras of welcome that fell like gentle rain into the dreams of sages and children on earth. One such child, sleeping in a humble hut near the forest, dreamt of a rider on a white horse. Not fierce, not terrible, but peaceful. The rider did not hold a weapon in her dream. He held a flower. He rode not through war, but through fields of tall grass lit by golden light. Wherever his horse's hooves touched the ground, fear dissolved like mist. The child woke with tears drying on her cheeks and a sweetness in her chest she could not explain. "Did you have a bad dream?" her mother asked. The girl shook her head. "No," she said. "I think the world had a good one." The narrator lingered beside her for a moment, sensing how the presence of Kalki, still formless, still beyond sight, had already begun to paint itself into the canvas of human dreams. In another corner of the world, an old man known for his skepticism sat on his porch, staring at the sky. He did not believe in gods, avatars, or prophecies. Life had made him practical, grounded, bitter. But tonight, as he watched the last light fade, he felt something in his chest soften without permission. He did not see visions. He did not hear voices. He simply felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he was not alone. A presence, gentle, respectful, unintrusive, surrounded him like warm air. He closed his eyes and whispered, almost shyly, "If you are real, you don't owe me miracles. Just stay." The narrator felt the sincerity of this request and knew it had not gone unanswered. The presence of the coming light was not arriving only for devotees, only for the faithful, only for the pure. It was arriving for everyone, believers, skeptics, saints, sinners, the weary, the hopeful, the angry, the lost. Because the end of Kali Yuga was not a reward for the good, nor a punishment for the bad. It was a rebalancing for all. The narrator rose above the earth, looking down upon it as a single breathing being. In the subtle fabric of existence, a soft glow had begun to form, like a dawn inside the world itself. This inner dawn grew brighter wherever hearts softened. It shimmered where forgiveness was offered. It glowed where courage chose truth over comfort. It brightened in the presence of quiet kindness no one else saw. And from beyond the last layer of visible light, the presence of Kalki moved closer, guided not by prophecy alone, but by the ripeness of human longing. The narrator's voice, gentle as a lullaby, floated through the unseen spaces. "You are not waiting for the end. The end is waiting for you, to remember who you are." As those words vibrated through the subtle plains, a woman closing her shop early to help a stranger carry their bags felt a strange peace. A man forgiving his brother after years of silence felt his chest lighten. A young person choosing truth over approval felt an unseen hand rest on their shoulder. None of them knew it, but they were making room for the light that returns. The age was still dark in places. There was still cruelty, still confusion, still greed and fear. But beneath all that, something luminous had begun to rise. The cracks in the age were no longer just breaks. They were becoming openings. And through them, the end of Kali Yuga was slowly, lovingly entering. The narrator drifted through the soft glow of pre-dawn air, feeling the world tremble gently, not with fear, but with anticipation. Something subtle, ancient, and beautiful was drawing near. Human hearts did not yet recognize the source of this tremor, but they sensed its warmth the way the skin senses sunlight before the dawn fully breaks. For ages, humanity had lived under the dense cloak of Kali Yuga, thick with illusion, noise, and separation. Now, the cloak was loosening. The weight was lifting. and the light behind it was beginning to show through. One morning, in a quiet fishing village by the sea, a fisherman pushed his small wooden boat into the water. He had done this every day of his life, without thought, without expectation. Fishing was his livelihood, his habit, his anchor. But today, as he rowed into deeper waters, an unusual calm settled over the sea. Waves that were usually restless moved like silk. The wind carried a soothing coolness that felt almost intentional. The fisherman paused his rowing and let the boat drift. He closed his eyes without meaning to, as though pulled by an invisible hand into stillness. In that stillness, he felt a sensation he had long forgotten. He felt safe, not safe from danger, safe from the weight of his own thoughts. His heart softened, and he whispered out loud, though no one was there to hear, "I don't know what's coming, but it feels good." The narrator watched this moment closely. This was happening everywhere, not in grand gestures, but in gentle shifts. On a busy highway, a man stuck in traffic turned off his radio for the first time and simply sat with himself, realizing how long it had been since he allowed silence to touch him. In a crowded market, a shopkeeper smiled at a stranger without bargaining, without expectation, simply out of warmth. In a faraway desert, a nomad stared at the stars and felt as if they were looking back at him. The presence approaching the world was not descending in thunder or flame. It was arriving through softness. In a dense forest, the narrator moved through tall, ancient trees whose roots dug deep into the earth's memory. The leaves shimmered faintly as if brushed by invisible light. Birds perched silently on branches instead of singing. They sensed a shift too. Nature has always known when the divine moves near. Deep within the forest, a young boy who had wandered too far from his village sat crying under a tree, lost and frightened. His sobs were small, but filled with fear. The forest around him responded, not aggressively, but with a quiet hush. The air around him thickened with warmth. The boy stopped crying. He felt held. He felt guided. He got up and began walking without understanding why, following some inner compass that had awakened suddenly. It led him straight toward the path back to his village. The narrator followed him for a moment, sensing the invisible hand that had gently led him. The presence of Kalki had not arrived yet, but its shadow, its grace, was beginning to touch the edges of the world. In a remote monastery, a wise master meditated near a river. His breaths were slow, his posture steady. He had spent decades seeking truth, but today something unusual disturbed his usual clarity. Not confusion, not agitation, a tremor. A soft vibration moved through him, rising from the base of his spine to the crown of his head. His eyes opened suddenly. The sunlight around him shimmered. The river glowed faintly. The trees seemed to pulse with a quiet life. The air felt charged with holiness. He whispered, "It has begun." He did not need to say more. His disciples, meditating nearby, felt the same tremor several seconds later. Their breaths caught. Their eyes widened. They looked around, confused, but didn't find anything different. Because the change wasn't outside. It was inside. The narrator drifted near the river, watching the ripples glow slightly brighter. The presence approaching the world was not descending onto earth. It was rising within it. In a vast city where millions lived in dense clusters of concrete and neon, a sudden power outage plunged entire neighborhoods into darkness. For a moment, people panicked. But within that darkness, something rare happened. People stepped outside their apartments and looked at the sky, a sky they had not seen clearly in years. Stars. Hundreds of them. Thousands. A child pointed in awe. A couple held hands in renewed tenderness. An old man cried softly because the stars reminded him of home. The narrator observed that this darkness had revealed something brighter than light. Kali Yuga was losing its grip. In a distant part of the world, an old sage lying sick in his hut opened his eyes suddenly. His breathing had been shallow for days, but now something invigorated him from within. His vision cleared. He saw, not with physical eyes, but with the inner sight of a lifetime of devotion, a radiant boundary at the edge of the world, shimmering like the threshold of a great sunrise. He whispered, voice trembling, "He comes, not to end us, but to end our forgetting." The narrator bowed lightly near the sage. Even those closest to the end of their lives were beginning to sense the dawn of a new age. Elsewhere, in a bustling household, a mother gently placed her infant to sleep. The baby's breathing was slow and steady. But then, for just a moment, a soft glow passed over the child's face, like moonlight slipping through a moving cloud. The mother blinked. It was gone. She dismissed it as imagination. But the narrator saw it clearly. Infants, freshly arrived from the subtle realms, are the first to sense the approaching light. Their hearts tremble with recognition. At the edge of existence, in the vast subtle plane where avatars choose their moments of descent, the presence of Kalki began to take a faint outline. The earliest whisper of a form that would one day be seen, felt, known. Not yet a rider, not yet a warrior, not yet a god revealed. For now, the presence remained in essence, a promise wrapped in compassion, a dawn wrapped in patience. The narrator watched as this essence moved one subtle layer closer to the world, like a tide quietly rising in the middle of the night. No storms formed, no stars fell, no divine trumpets sounded. The change was in the air, in the heart, in the breath. And as the narrator drifted above the world, a single truth resonated through the stillness. The light does not return in power. It returns in permission. Permission granted by human longing, by human surrender, by human readiness. And humanity, weary yet hopeful, was finally becoming ready. Night unfolded slowly, like a long exhale, across the world. But this night was not heavy. It carried softness, an almost sacred quiet, that touched rooftops, rivers, forests, and forgotten corners with equal tenderness. The narrator drifted gently over the landscape, sensing that the presence drawing nearer was no longer just a distant glow. It was becoming intimate, close enough to be felt by the simplest hearts, the gentlest minds, the quietest breaths. The world did not know why it felt different, but it did. In a small village where the lamplight flickered against mud walls, a farmer sat alone outside his home. His body was tired from years of labor, his spirit worn by the monotony of life. Yet tonight, he felt a strange clarity settle upon him, as if someone had placed a warm hand upon his shoulder. He looked at the sky. The stars shimmered softly, like eyes filled with compassion. The farmer whispered, almost embarrassed by his own vulnerability, "Please, whoever watches, let this world heal." The narrator felt the sincerity of his plea resonate through the subtle planes, and the presence, still without form, yet undeniably alive, heard it. In a bustling city, a young woman locked her shop late at night and began walking home through narrow alleys. Normally, she would hurry, wary of shadows. But tonight, something in the air felt protective. She slowed her steps, breathing deeply. A faint, inexplicable glow illuminated the path. Not enough to be called light, yet enough to erase her fear. As she walked, she realized something simple but profound. I feel safe in the darkness. Her heart softened. In a world long ruled by anxiety, to feel safe without reason was a miracle. The narrator moved beside her, invisible as breeze. In a distant mountain cave, an old sage meditated in silence. His breaths were deep, steady, ancient. He had felt many shifts in the ages, many tremors, many illusions. But what he felt now was unlike anything before. A warmth pressed gently against his forehead, as if light were trying to enter through the gates of his mind. His spine tingled from the base to the crown. Tears rolled down his cheeks unbidden. He whispered into the cave, "The light remembers us." And the cave echoed back softly, "Remembers us, remembers us." In a temple by a holy river, a priest cleaned the inner sanctum, gently wiping dust from the stone floor. His hands moved with reverence, though his mind had grown weary after years of ritual without connection. Suddenly, the air around him shifted. The lamp flames steadied themselves, perfectly still, as if held in suspended breath. The priest froze. A silence filled the sanctum. Not emptiness, presence. Something divine brushed past him, tender as a sigh. His heart pounded, not with fear but with awe, and in that brief moment, he felt the unmistakable sensation of being seen completely. He dropped to his knees, sobbing softly, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming beauty of being touched by something holy. The narrator lingered in that temple, watching the priest tremble with unexpected gratitude. The presence drawing nearer had begun to brush the edges of the physical world. It was no longer only inside hearts. It had stepped into the cracks of reality. In the quiet hours before dawn, an extraordinary calm spread across oceans. Whales sang deeper songs. Waves softened. Coral glowed faintly. Even the tides hesitated, as though pausing to align themselves with the rhythm of the coming light. In the Arctic, where cold ruled endlessly, a mother polar bear curled around her cub felt an unusual warmth beneath her fur. She lifted her head, sniffing the air. The world felt kinder. Animals have always sensed the divine before humans do. From the subtle realm of Devis, faint murmurs filled the heavens. These were not warnings, not celebrations, but acknowledgments. He is nearing the veil. The narrator heard these murmurs ripple outward like soft thunder. Across the earth, sensitive souls felt a pull towards stillness. A poet paused midline, struck by a sudden wave of inspiration. A warrior polishing his weapon stopped and set it aside, feeling no desire to carry it. A widow looking at an old photograph felt peace rather than grief. A child looking at the horizon felt excitement for no reason at all. The unseen light was rearranging the emotional landscape of humanity. Not by force, by resonance. People began to feel tiny bursts of clarity, like lanterns being lit in long dark corners of the mind. Confusion lifted enough for truth to enter. Fear softened enough for love to breathe. Hurt loosened enough for forgiveness to step forward. And across the world, millions of small, almost invisible, acts of goodness unfolded without fanfare. A stranger helped an elderly man cross a busy street. A mother forgave her child with unusual tenderness. A boy fed a hungry dog. A shopkeeper refused extra payment from a poor customer. Neighbors shared fruit over a broken fence. These were not coincidences. These were echoes of the approaching light. The narrator drifted through these moments like a gentle witness, understanding the deeper truth unfolding. The end of Kali Yuga would not be triggered by destruction. It would be triggered by readiness. When enough hearts soften, when enough minds remember, when enough souls yearn sincerely. Light returns, not as a storm, not as a battle cry, but as a dawn. And now, the dawn was very, very close. In the subtle realm where avatars take form, the luminous presence shifted once more. It was no longer just an essence, no longer just a glow. It had begun to shape itself, faint outlines like mist gathering into form. The narrator sensed it clearly. A figure was forming, still distant, still incomplete, but undeniable. The one who would one day be seen as Kalki was nearly ready to step into the world, and the world was nearly ready to receive him. The narrator whispered into the quiet night. Light does not return to end the world. It returns to awaken it. All across the earth, millions slept deeply, not knowing that the gentle warmth in their dreams was the brush of a divine presence. The last night of any age does not announce itself with thunder. It arrives quietly, like a familiar guest returning after a long journey. The world did not know that this night was different from all the others, but the narrator felt it in the very fabric of existence. There was a looseness now in the weave of Kali Yuga, as if the threads of darkness had grown too tired to hold. The illusion of separateness, which had once seemed so solid, now felt thin, fragile, ready to tear. The stars shone with a softer brilliance. The air carried the faintest scent of something new. The silence had depth, as though we're listening back. The presence that had been slowly drawing nearer compassion woven into light, promise wrapped in patience, was now standing at the very edge of the world. Not yet visible to human eyes, but no longer distant. In a small village where mud houses leaned into each other like old friends, dawn approached slowly. A rooster crowed once, then again. The village stirred. Inside one of the houses, a young boy woke before the light fully arrived. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, wondering why he felt such unmistakable calm in his chest. It was as if he had slept not in a bed, but in a blessing. He walked outside, bare feet touching the cool earth. The sky was still dark blue, but a faint golden line had appeared at the horizon, painted so gently that it seemed the world had inhaled light instead of exhaled it. The boy watched wide-eyed. He didn't know that he was witnessing more than a sunrise. He was witnessing the first visible breath of a new age. The narrator hovered above that horizon, watching the light gather in slow, tender waves. This dawn carried something different. It had not just brightened the land, it soothed it. Far from the village, in a busy metropolis where buildings stabbed the sky and roads wound like restless veins, the same dawn crept between towers, slipped quietly across glass and steel, and slid through curtains into the rooms of those still asleep. A woman lying awake with worry in her chest watched the light slowly fill her window. Instead of feeling pressed by another demanding day, she felt supported. The light seemed to say, "You do not carry this alone." Her breath softened. Her shoulders relaxed. Her thoughts lost some of their sharpness. In another apartment, a man who had grown numb to beauty noticed how the sunlight rested on a cup of tea, turning it into a small pool of liquid gold. He stared, strangely moved. How long has it looked like this? He wondered, as if the light had changed. The narrator knew. The light had not changed. Human hearts had. They were beginning to see the world not through the strain of fear, but through the soft lens of awakening. In a quiet temple on a hill, bells rang to welcome the new day. The priest moved through his rituals with unusual grace, his mind unusually still. The flame of the lamp in front of the deity burned brighter than usual, its glow steady, unshaken even by the morning breeze. He felt it again, that presence he had sensed days earlier. This time, it did not brush past him. It stayed. He closed his eyes and whispered, "If this is the end of the age, let it be an end made of love." The narrator felt his words ripple outward, joining countless other unspoken prayers, heartfelt wishes, and quiet desires that had risen from humanity. Those ripples met the presence waiting at the threshold. The time had come. In the subtle planes just beyond human sight, the luminous essence that would one day be called Kalki completed its formation. It was still brighter than suns, more vast than galaxies, yet began to condense into something the world could touch. A form, not yet flesh, but defined. A rider, a horse, a sword, not of iron, but of truth. The narrator watched with reverent calm. Avatars do not descend as strangers. They descend as the answer to a call the world barely remembers it made. In this case, the call was not made in words. It was made in weariness, a weariness of violence, a weariness of dishonesty, a weariness of endless striving without peace. The presence felt this weariness, not with judgment, but with compassion deeper than oceans. And so, it stepped forward. At the very edge of the cosmic veil, where divine and mortal meet, a single sound emerged, not from mouths, not from instruments, but from the heart of existence itself. It was not loud. It did not shake mountains or split sky. It sounded like a soft chime deep inside every soul. Many did not consciously hear it, but they felt it. A merchant paused while opening his stall, struck by the sudden need to say a silent thank you before beginning the day. A child picking up a stone to throw at another suddenly dropped it, confused by his own change of mind. A soldier polishing his weapon felt an inexplicable heaviness in his chest and set it down. The narrator knew what this inner chime meant. The veil had parted. The presence had entered the age. In a hidden place between worlds, a luminous crossroads where all times overlap, Kalki took one step closer to Earth. The step was not in space, but in being. No one saw a rider in the sky. No one saw a blazing sword. Not yet. But people began to see themselves more clearly. In that clarity, the end of Kali Yuga quietly accelerated. Patterns of harm began to feel more painful to those who repeated them. Acts of kindness began to feel more natural, less like effort, more like instinct. Falsehood grew harder to maintain. Truth, even when uncomfortable, became strangely attractive. The narrator drifted among these shifts with a gentle awareness. The age had started to turn, not suddenly like a page in a book, but gradually like the tide. And as the tide of time began its great inward sweep, the light that returns, now inside the age itself, continued its silent work, softening hearts, clearing minds, guiding choices. The end of Kali Yuga was no longer a prophecy. It was in motion. The days that followed did not look like the end of the world. The sky did not split open. The oceans did not rise to swallow cities. Mountains did not crumble. To most eyes, life went on as it always had. But beneath the familiar surface, the direction of the age had changed. Kali Yuga had been a downward slope, a slow descent into confusion, haste, and separation. Now, for the first time in a very long time, the slope softened. The drop slowed. The fall began to turn into a curve. It was not yet an upward climb, but it was no longer a fall. The narrator drifted gently across fields and rooftops, temples and warehouses, forests and markets, observing how the presence of Kalki, still mostly unseen, was beginning to clarify Dharma not with commands, but with inner knowing. In a courthouse where justice had long been entangled with power, a weary judge sat before a stack of cases. He had grown used to bending truth to appease influence, to compromising what he once knew was right. His heart had become numb to the small tremors of conscience. On this day, as he read through another case, his fingers trembled slightly. A sentence leapt from the page, a simple fact that made the path of justice unmistakably clear. He felt the old numbness rise and then crack. His chest tightened, as if someone had placed a mirror there and asked him to look. He saw himself, not as a judge, not as a figure of authority, but as a soul who had strayed from his own center. The realization hurt, but the hurt felt clean, like a necessary wound. He closed his eyes and whispered, "No more lies." When he opened them, his decision was clear. He ruled fairly, not just according to law, but according to truth. No one in the courtroom knew what had changed, but Dharma had re-entered a place it had long left. The narrator watched with tender attention. Across the world, similar moments unfolded. A businesswoman, known for cutting corners, suddenly found herself unable to cheat without feeling deeply unsettled. A politician, used to spinning half-truths, stopped mid-sentence in front of cameras, aware of a strange hollowness in his own words. A teacher, tempted to ignore a struggling student, felt instead a strong pull to sit beside them, explain patiently, and stay a little longer after class. These were small acts, yet together, they formed a quiet river of correction. The presence of Kalki, still more like a vibration than a figure, was gently polishing the mirror of human conscience. Not by force, by reminding. In a small hermitage at the edge of a forest, a disciple asked his guru, "Master, will Kalki come riding a white horse? Will the sword blaze with fire? Will the wicked be destroyed?" The guru smiled softly, lines of kindness deepening at the corners of his eyes. "Kalki's sword," he replied, "is truth. Wherever hearts are ready to accept truth, he has already come." The disciple frowned. "But what about the ending of the age? The destruction?" The guru looked up at the sky, where clouds drifted lazily. "Kali Yuga ends," he said gently, "not when the world is destroyed, but when the lies we live by are no longer able to stand. Destruction happens inside first. Outside, it will look like correction, healing, and letting go." The disciple fell silent, absorbing this. Somewhere inside him, a fear he had carried about the end of the world softened into trust. The narrator floated above the hermitage, listening. Throughout the lands, the same pattern emerged. People who had long justified harm began to feel its weight more heavily. Those who had doubted goodness found themselves drawn to small acts of care. Those who had lived in arrogance began to taste humility when they saw their limitations clearly. This was not punishment. It was clarity. The presence of Kalki was like a light in a dark room. It did not break anything by itself. It simply made it difficult to pretend. In a large city, a man sitting in front of multiple screens, tracking money and markets, felt a sudden hollow ache. The numbers that once thrilled him now felt empty. His mind raced, trying to find the next profit. His heart, however, whispered a different question. What is all this for? He had dodged that question for years. Tonight, he could not. The narrator sensed the gentle but insistent pulse of truth pressing against his awareness. The man did not suddenly become a saint. He did not abandon everything overnight. But something shifted. The next morning, he anonymously paid for a stranger's medical bill. It was only one act, but it was a doorway. Elsewhere, in a small house lit by a single lamp, a young woman sat across from her aging father. They had not spoken kindly in years, weighed down by old anger and misunderstandings. A familiar argument rose to the surface. Voices sharpened, eyes hardened, words lined up, ready to wound. Then, unexpectedly, she saw the tremble of his frail hands. He saw the exhaustion in her tired eyes. Something broke, not between them, within them. She lowered her voice. He softened his gaze. "I'm tired of fighting," she said quietly. "So am I," he replied, his voice almost breaking. They did not resolve everything that night, but they did something more important. They stopped adding to the pile of hurt. The narrator watched as the unseen presence, compassion moving through time, rested gently in that room. Kali Yuga had thrived on accumulated hurt, on unending cycles of reaction and retaliation. The end of the age would arrive one moment at a time, when people simply chose not to continue those cycles. In the subtle realms, where Kalki's presence continued to condense toward form, a quiet joy spread. He did not need to tear the world apart. The world was beginning, in its own weary way, to tear its illusions apart. The narrator rose above the lands and oceans, seeing them now not as separate places, but as one being, as a single, vast heart learning slowly to beat in rhythm again. The dawn after darkness was not a sudden event. It was a gradual alignment. And as the presence of Kalki drew even closer to manifestation, the narrator whispered into the listening world. The age is not ending because it is hated. It is ending because it is complete, like a long lesson finally understood, like a deep exhale finally released. The world was almost ready to step into its next breath. The change that swept across the world was not loud. It did not travel like lightning, nor spread like wildfire. It moved instead like fragrance, subtle, silent, unmistakable. A sweetness entered the breath of the age, and though people could not name it, they felt its presence in the spaces between thoughts. The narrator drifted slowly over rivers, turning gold beneath the late afternoon sun. Birds skimmed the surface of the water, wings glowing briefly before fading into the quiet sky. Nature sensed what humans only half realized. A chapter of time was preparing to close. In a village where life flowed at a gentle pace, an old carpenter sat outside his workshop, smoothing wood with slow, practiced movements. His hands had shaped cradles, doors, coffins, and temple pillars, objects that held every phase of human life. Yet in all these years, he had rarely paused to reflect. Today, as he carved a simple wooden bowl, he felt a stillness blossom inside him, like a flower opening without sound. He ran his fingers along the wood's grain and whispered, "I have taken more than I've given." The confession surprised him. It softened him. It made him tremble. And in that trembling, he felt for the first time that it was not too late to change, not too late to be gentle, not too late to give more than he received. The narrator hovered near him, sensing the purpose beneath this quiet awakening. Kali Yuga was not ending through punishment. It was ending through realization. In a busy city, A young man buried beneath ambition paused while scrolling through endless distractions. His chest ached, not from illness, but from a kind of spiritual thirst he had long ignored. He turned off his device and stared out the window. The sunset tonight was unusually soft, its colors blending like the brushstrokes of a patient artist. Something inside him loosened. What am I chasing? He wondered. The question did not come from guilt. It came from clarity. And clarity, when it appears in the heart of Kali Yuga, is a sign that the age is losing its hold. The narrator watched the young man breathe deeply, then place his hand over his chest, not in pain, but in recognition. Within that gesture lay centuries of forgotten wisdom resurfacing through a single moment. Elsewhere, in a crowded marketplace, two merchants known for fierce competition found themselves negotiating with unexpected patience. Instead of deceit, honesty flowed. Instead of rivalry, fairness. They parted with a nod of mutual respect. Neither had offered the other in decades. Around them, no one noticed a shift, but the narrator noticed. It was in places like these, small, human, unremarkable on the surface, that the dawn of a new age was first appearing. Because the next Yuga does not arrive with celestial trumpets. It arrives in human choices. In a monastery high in the mountains, the wind carried a faint hum, so soft it could have been mistaken for imagination. But the monks meditating within those stone walls felt it in their bones. It was not thunder, not chanting, not any earthly sound. It was the subtle vibration of a veil thinning. One monk opened his eyes, startled. Another smiled, recognizing the sensation. The eldest monk bowed his head, whispering, "He is at the threshold." Their breaths synchronized, the way strings of an instrument resonate when played near another. The presence of Kalki, still beyond sight but fully inside the realm, had begun to align hearts across the world. In a quiet home near the edge of a forest, a child sat on the floor, drawing in the sand with a small stick. She drew a circle, then erased it. Drew a line, then erased that too. Then, quite suddenly, without thinking, she drew a simple figure. A rider on a horse. Her mother watched with mild surprise. "What are you drawing, little one?" "A man," the child answered softly. "Coming to help." Her mother smiled, unaware of the significance. But the narrator recognized the imprint. Children, always the first to feel the nearness of divine presence. In a remote desert, a traveler rested beside a dune under a sky full of stars. His journey had been long, and loneliness had become his companion. But as he lay down, he felt a strange comfort wash over him. The stars above seemed brighter, almost warm. His heart, cold from years of solitude, softened. He closed his eyes and whispered, "If I'm not alone tonight, thank you." That whisper, carried by the desert wind, joined countless others rising from the human heart. Questions, fears, hopes, forgiveness, longing. Together, they formed a luminous thread stretching from earth into the subtle realms. The presence of Kalki touched that thread, not to pull the world upward, but to descend gently into it. In that moment, the narrator sensed something profound. A threshold had been crossed. In the subtle plane, just beyond physical reality, the form of Kalki grew clearer, like the outline of dawn sharpening into day. Still not flesh, still not fully here, yet undeniably real. The narrator felt an overwhelming peace emanating from this forming presence. It was the peace of someone who understands suffering and does not judge it. The peace of someone who arrives not to punish, but to uplift. And in places all over the world, people felt echoes of that peace. A grieving widow found herself able to breathe without breaking. A man ashamed of his past felt the first spark of self-forgiveness. A child afraid of the dark found courage in the gentleness of night. A healer burdened by others' pain felt her own wounds soften. These were signs, not dramatic, not supernatural, but deeply, intimately human. Kali Yuga was ending not because darkness was being destroyed, but because light was being remembered. The narrator drifted across the world, witnessing countless small dawns within countless small hearts. The actual dawn of the next age would not appear in the sky. It would appear in those hearts first. And now, they were beginning to shine. As the narrator rose above mountains and seas, sensing the entire world breathing more quietly than it had in centuries, a soft whisper echoed through the fabric of existence, spoken by no being, yet heard everywhere. The night is almost over. The end of Kali Yuga was no longer approaching. It had begun. The night before the end of Kali Yuga was unlike any other night. Not because the stars changed, nor because the earth shook, but because hearts across the world softened in the same breath. It was the first time in thousands of years that humanity aligned in a feeling, even without knowing it. A collective exhale moved through millions of chests, a shared longing whispered in countless souls. The narrator glided over the quiet world, sensing this alignment like a gentle, glowing thread woven through the air. It was time, not for destruction, not for fire, not for judgment, but for completion. In a small coastal village, fishermen awoke earlier than usual, drawn by an unfamiliar calm. They walked out to the beach, expecting the chilly breath of dawn winds, but instead they felt warmth, like early morning sunlight before the sun had risen. The horizon glowed faintly. Not orange, not yellow, something somewhere between gold and white. The fishermen stared in silence. Something within them stilled. Fear, longing, and even the habitual rush of daily life paused. One of them whispered, "It feels alive." The narrator hovered above the horizon, where the glow grew brighter, softer, deeper. This was not sunlight. It was presence. In the high towers of a metropolis, office lights flickered off one by one. Not due to outage, but because workers suddenly felt no urgency to continue rushing. People leaned back in their chairs, breathing slowly, as if a weight they had carried for years had lifted. In temples, worshippers found themselves silent, not chanting, because the silence itself felt like prayer. In homes, families sat closer, speaking gently. In forests, animals gathered without fear. In deserts, wind patterns slowed, circling as though greeting something sacred. Everywhere, the world softened, as if preparing to welcome a guest too holy for noise. Somewhere beyond human sight, at the boundary between the divine and the mortal, the figure of Kalki stood fully formed for the first time. Not yet on earth, but no longer beyond it. A rider atop a radiant white steed. A being of stillness and clarity. A gaze full of compassion rather than wrath. His sword, if it could be called that, shimmered with a light that did not cut, but purified. A blade of pure truth. A blade that dissolved illusion, not beings. He did not look angry. He did not look fierce. He looked tender, as though he had spent thousands of years watching a beloved child struggle in darkness, waiting patiently for the moment that child would finally open their eyes. Now, the moment had arrived. Kalki took a single step forward, not onto earth, but into connection with it. A pulse spread from his presence, not a shockwave, not a blast, but a gentle ring, like the pure tone of a bell struck once in eternity. That ring spread across the world. People felt it as a sudden breath of relief for the anxious, a warm tear falling for the grieving, a moment of clarity for the confused, a small courage awakening in the fearful, a soft forgiveness rising in the angry. The narrator felt this ring echo through all realms. It was not an end. It was a recalibration. The age, long heavy, long lost, was being realigned to truth. In a hut lit by a single lantern, an old woman sitting alone felt a warmth surround her. She closed her eyes, whispering, "Who are you?" A voice inside her, not heard through ears, but through the space behind her ribs, replied, "I am what you have always sought." She wept without sadness. She slept without fear. Across the world, similar moments unfolded like petals. A man forgiven by someone he had wronged felt a weight leave his shoulders. A mother watching her child sleep felt gratitude deeper than she had ever known. A prisoner meditating in solitude felt compassion for the first time in his life. Kalki had not descended in physical form, but he had entered consciousness. And consciousness is where ages truly end. The first light of dawn finally touched the world. But this dawn was unlike any before it. The narrator watched as the sky brightened not only from the rising sun, but from the inner brightness awakening across humanity. People everywhere paused at the same moment, as though feeling the earth take a deeper breath. A young girl picking flowers suddenly smiled for no reason. A soldier guarding a border lowered his weapon. A monk in a distant monastery opened his eyes, whispering, "Welcome." A scientist staring at a screen froze as equations suddenly aligned perfectly in his mind. A shift had taken place. The sun rose gently, its light seeming warmer, softer, more comforting than usual, as though it too were bowing to the presence now woven into the world. Kalki had not yet stepped onto the earth in physical form, but his arrival had already begun. The age of forgetting was ending. The age of remembering was beginning. As the light of morning spread across the world, the narrator felt the last threads of Kali Yuga unravel quietly. No explosion, no catastrophe, just a releasing, like an old story bowing out gracefully. The darkness did not scream. It did not shatter. It simply dissolved, not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer needed. Humanity had learned what it came to learn. The age had fulfilled its purpose. The cycle was ready to turn. The narrator whispered one final time to the world, "You have survived the night. Now awaken." And the earth, in its own deep way, did. Kalki's presence now lingers in every softened heart, every honest breath, every act of compassion. The next Yuga awaits, not in the sky, but in the human soul. Kali Yuga did not end with fire. It ended with an awakening. It ended with light. It ended with you.